What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Friday, everybody. I hope you're having a good end of the week. You're staying safe wherever you are, and you have a good weekend ahead of you. I have a business trip this weekend again, and so this episode may be a little bit shorter than usual. My apologies also for this week. I've had overtime at my firm, and I've had to record many of these episodes in my office at work, and so the audio quality is a little bit suboptimal. My apologies for that. Hopefully the audio quality will be back to normal from next week. Now, of course, the world is watching the crisis unfold between Russia and the Ukraine. We've been discussing over the last few weeks the sort of difficult position an invasion would put Beijing in. Back Russia, one of China's last major external friends, albeit a fair-weather friend, or stay at arm's length to protect relations with the European Union and prevent the bottom falling out of the US-China relationship. A resolution is being drafted in the United Nations condemning Russia, which may force China to take a more formal position in the coming days. However, at the moment, the official statements coming out of Beijing over the last 24 hours seem a little confused, as if officials were somewhat caught off guard with the speed in which things have deteriorated. Hua Chunying, who was recently promoted to Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs, has returned to speak as a senior spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of the PRC. We can see from her language that Beijing is not ready to take a firm position, deflecting a journalist's question and then moving into whataboutism. Quote, "I'm sure you have noticed that Russia stated in its special military operation in Ukraine, its armed forces will not conduct any missile or artillery strikes on any Ukrainian city. As to the definition of invasion, it brings us back to how we view the current situation in Ukraine. Here is another question. Western media, including your agency, used the word invasion for Russia's operation. When the US took illegal unilateral military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan without the mandate of the United Nations and caused massive civilian casualties, did you use the word invasion or some other word?" End quote. Currently, the firmest statement we have from a high official in Beijing is from Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He expressed today, quote, "Noting that China has always respected the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, China recognizes the complex and special historical context of the Ukraine issue and understands Russia's legitimate security concerns." End quote. One of the best breakdowns I have seen regarding what the Ukraine crisis means for Chinese policymakers comes from Evan Feigenbaum, Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In a piece published today, he argues that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an important test of China's policy evolution, tactical positioning, and strategic choices. Quote, "Beijing is selfish about its own interests and will not want Washington to be the one to frame China's alternatives." End quote. But Beijing is trying to strike an impossible balance by seeking to pursue 3 goals simultaneously: a strategic partnership with Russia, commitment to long-standing foreign policy principles of so-called territorial integrity and non-interference, and a desire to minimize collateral damage from EU and US sanctions. He argues that Beijing cannot reconcile these 3 competing objectives. Quote, "And since it cannot have all 3, it will have to jettison one or another, or else uncomfortably shift its position from day to day under the glare of international scrutiny." End quote. China's almost certain choice will be to abandon its principles while prioritizing power politics and practical considerations. He concludes that in Ukraine, Beijing faces unusually stark contradictions, and it will find these contradictions almost impossible to balance. It will pay a cost with the transatlantic West for its lean towards Moscow. It will pay a cost too for breaking with Moscow. China cannot avoid making choices, and these will decisively shape Chinese foreign policy for at least the next decade. Despite, frankly, exaggerated reports in recent days, Ukraine does not provide China with the majority of its food. However, China does import large quantities of food from the country, and as such, issues of food security and inflation are real serious questions policymakers need to wrestle with. In 2019, China surpassed Russia to become Ukraine's biggest trading partner, with bilateral trade valued at around $19.3 billion in 2021, according to People's Republic of China customs data. The two big Ukrainian exports to China are iron ore and agricultural products. According to both Ukrainian and Chinese data, Chinese corn, wheat, and barley imports are vulnerable. About 54% of Ukrainian barley goes to China, accounting for 28% of China's barley imports. About 30% of Ukraine's corn exports go to China, with the United States being the biggest competitor. So farmers in the United States may gain from the current crisis. We remember in 2020, Beijing rolled out a new policy called Common Prosperity. Well, actually the idea is old and has many interpretations, much like the word, say, liberalism has different definitions and meanings in the West and is forever argued by different schools of thought. The push for common prosperity over the last 18 months or so is the biggest push we've seen from the center of the country in decades, at least since the Deng era. We have some general idea about what it means, and we've been discussing it on China Update for well over a year and a half now. But policymakers have still been quite light on specifics. This is likely because policymakers themselves are still debating what these specifics should be. We see evidence of internal debates with leaks, speeches, and inconsistencies across different state media. This suggests that this internal debate is ongoing. Last week, an official with the powerful National Development and Reform Commission said at an event that with common prosperity, China must guard against, quote, falling into the trap of welfarism, end quote, the system of welfare seen in Western Europe which, quote unquote, supports laziness. The National Development and Reform Commission official charged with employment issues told reporters that common prosperity requires hard work, adding that it must be implemented with a do-what-you-can, 量力而行 manner, expressing, quote, do what you can attitude means that we must realize soberly that China's level of development is still lagging far behind those of developed countries. We must make sure that the guarantee of livelihood and improvement of livelihood be based on economic development and fiscal sustainability. We cannot overshoot or overly stimulate appetite and make promises we can't fulfill. End quote. These statements came after the National Development and Reform Commission, in a separate move, warned local authorities against, quote, over-promising on social welfare, end quote, while developing common prosperity policies. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, reporting on the directive, observed that in July, one of China's richest provinces, Zhejiang Province, outlined a strategy to narrow its wealth gap by 2025, a common prosperity pilot program. We covered it at the time. The Zhejiang government has prioritized raising wages for poor workers, setting a target to boost the proportion of households with an annual disposable income of between 100,000 RMB, about $15,000, and 500,000 RMB to 80%, while 45% of its households should have an income of 200,000 RMB to 600,000 RMB. Okay, now let's continue with our daily coverage of China's property industry, which has been rocked by a string of defaults by major developers in recent months, following a government crackdown on excessive borrowing and speculation in the housing market. If you guys are enjoying the content, by the way, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you're watching for the first time and you're getting some value from this analysis and this news, maybe consider subscribing. We release one of these every day, and you'll have the most up-to-date analysis on China as these are released. Yesterday we discussed Shimao Group and why we need to follow it. Shimao has become a bellwether for financial contagion in China's property industry after it came under pressure to pay its debt in recent months. It was considered one of the healthier property developers in the sector by the wider market, and as such the market is watching it closely. Domestic financial outlet Cailian argues that while Shimao said it has had no defaults in the open market last month, it remains exposed to a trust loan or trust loans. We discussed this yesterday in detail, high-yielding short-term instruments that had been sold to wealthy Chinese residents and institutes. Now, let's quickly look at another important developer that we need to follow, one which is also grappling with its own crisis, in what Bloomberg's Hong Kong analysts argue is the, quote, latest sign of the Chinese property developers' cash woes, end quote. Zhenro, or Zhenro in Chinese, Properties Group Limited, said it may negotiate with creditors to extend repayments on offshore debt, including asset-backed securities and syndicated loans due this year. The comments by Zhenro executives during investor calls this week came after the company proposed to swap $5 and RMB bonds due in 2022 for new notes. Zhenro Properties Group, along with Jingrei Properties, both this week sought to delay repayments on dollar-denominated bonds worth $1.2 billion maturing this year. They are also asking bondholders to waive some default clauses on $3.5 billion of notes. Today, Zhenro's 5.98% dollar paper due April of this year fell more than 11 cents on the dollar to an incredible 14 cents on the dollar, a sign that the market has very little confidence that it will be repaid. Hey guys, I'd love to hear what you thought about some of the updates we covered in today's episode, so throw your comments below. Always love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.